Welcome back, guys. Today I'm going to show you how I cut these thin strips of wood here at the table saw for cutting board glue-ups using just a simple jig off of Amazon. If that sounds interesting, stick around and I'll show you how I do it. So one way to give your cutting board some visual appeal is to kind of vary the widths of the boards that you use for your slats when you're gluing things up. And normally those are going to range from, let's say, 3/4 of an inch up to 2 or 3 inches, probably is the max for a glue up. But if you went and you could get, let's say, a 1/16 of an inch strip or a 1/4 inch strip, and you could get some of those and kind of layer those together with some of the larger ones, you can kind of elevate your board to the next level. So to do something like that, we're going to use a jig called a thin rip jig, and that's going to allow us to do something that you would otherwise not necessarily be able to safely do at the table saw. So if you're a newer woodworker or you're not super familiar with table saws, you may be thinking that you can just move your table saw fence as close to the blade as you need it and make those strips anyways without needing some special jig to do that. And in theory, you technically can move the fence as close to the blade as you want without actually touching it and cut a thin strip, but the likelihood for kickback is far greater. And the reason that is you have nothing to support your cut from the cut side, on the fence side. And because let's say you're doing an 1/8 inch strip, which is even smaller than one of these jigs, can safely pass between the blade and the fence. So if you're doing something that small, you've got nothing to push your board through. So you're gonna naturally try and push it through from the off-cut side of the blade. Doing that will almost always result in a kickback situation and is very dangerous. So you can, depending on the size of board that you put through here, it can impale you pretty hard and do some serious damage. So you definitely don't want to do that. Instead, you're going to use something like this, and this is called a thin rip jig. This one happens to be made by Going Make, and it's just a Chinese brand, cheap, not cheap aluminum, I guess, but it's an aluminum die cut jig here. This one runs about $30 on Amazon, which is way cheaper than the hospital bill to take care of the injuries for trying to cut it the wrong way. So let me bring you in and show you exactly how this jig works. So here is the beast. Again, this one's made by Going Make, Amazon special. The mounting mechanism for the saw in this case happens to be some miter slot. I don't even know what you call these, but they just get captured in your miter slot, and then you tighten them down to lock it in place. And it also does come with a couple T-bolts, so you could put it in a T-track as well, depending on what exactly you're doing. That might be handy if you need to use this over, let's say, at the router table or something like that. The nice thing about this particular one, and I'm not sure if this is unique to this or if it's something that a lot of them have, is this one has a bearing that your board will pass against as you're running your piece through the saw. Now, the nice thing about this particular bearing is it's a one-way bearing. So it will, as long as you've got this on the correct side, it will allow you to push your board through, but it will not allow the board to come back, or it makes it a lot more difficult for the board to come back. And that will help reduce the likelihood of a kickback, because even though we're doing it a much safer way, there's always a chance for kickback, right? So it's just an extra safety feature that goes into this particular one. All right, so now that we know what not to do when you're cutting your thin strips, let me show you how to set up this jig. So to start with, we're going to mount it at the same area as our blade is. And the reason we're going to do this is going to allow us to set the width of our cut before we put it in its final position. So we're just going to undo this knob that holds the adjustment mechanism and slide it all the way over to the blade as far as you want it. And this one has enough travel that it can actually touch the blade. Now obviously we want to actually get a piece of wood out of this when we're done. So if we have this touching the blade, it's going to cut right on the blade and it's just going to make sawdust. All right, so to determine the width of our board that we're going to get as an offcut, again, because we're doing it this way, our offcut is going to be our keeper piece, not the piece that rides against the fence, which is what would normally occur on a normal table saw cut, right? So to measure that out, we can just measure off the blade how far we want that to be, or if you have setup blocks of any kind that match the width of what you're trying to go for, or like if you're going for a 1/4 inch, if you have a piece of 1/4 inch plywood or something, there's always something you can use to reference with, but you're just gonna either measure or have some sort of reference and move this back as far as you want that cut to be. And in my case, I'm gonna go for about, let's see, what is that? That's about 1/4 inch. I want that just a little bit tighter than that. All right, now that we've got our width set for the board that we're going to cut, we need to turn our attention to the throat plate. Now, this one happens to be 13 3/4 deep, so you can say this is a deep throat. Now, what we want to do is we want to avoid our wood getting deep throated. And what I mean by that is if your offcut piece, which is our keeper piece, goes into this slot here, there's a potential that the blade could catch that board when it drops in and either kick it out, or it's going to ruin the piece when it catches the blade again. So that's no good. So you can fix that by just putting a piece of tape over the throat plate before you put the throat plate back on, and then you can turn your saw on and raise the blade through the tape to kind of make that initial cut so that you can safely make that thin rip. So let's put that on now. Okay, now that we've got that done, I've got this repositioned, and this is going to be the final place that you're going to leave this here. So we're going to put this, let's say about 2.5, 3 inches behind the blade. The center of mine happens to be at about 2 3/4. That's a good spot for that. And now comes the beauty of this style of cut. We can get the same cut over and over and over as many times as we need just by moving the fence, making it just kiss, and locking the fence down. That's it. That will give us our cut that we want. And then every time we make a cut, we'll just have to bump the fence over until the board touches again and we can go again. So let me show you how that goes. Okay, so not hard, right? So I need to give you 2 words of caution, I guess. Be careful. No, I'm just kidding. But definitely be careful. But what I want to tell you is there's 2 things that matter when you're going to do thin rips like this. Especially when you have something that is blocking your offcut from getting any wider as you push the board through. Your board must be square to start with. So if you're starting with rough lumber, this needs to be surfaced on all 4 sides. If you're buying it, buy it already surfaced on 4 sides or buy it surfaced on 3 sides. But the main goal here is that the side riding against the fence and the side that is going to be your piece that you get out of that, the offcut side, they need to be parallel from each other with almost no variation. So if it's 2 inches at this end, it needs to be 2 inches at that end. If it gets wider at the end, the closest towards your body, as you're pushing it through, it's going to slow down and stop. You're not going to be able to push it anymore because that thin rip jig is going to keep it from pushing in any further because it has no give. If it's thicker, wider at the top of the at the front of the board away from you, when you set your thin rip, you're gonna get the first part in, and then the rest of it's not actually running against that thin rip jig. So if you're not sure, cut a very thin pass. As long as you're sure one side is flat, cut a very small pass off of the other edge with the fence. Make sure your fence is square, so that you can get both sides parallel to each other before you start making your thin rips. The other tip or tidbit applies to cutting board making in general is your blade needs to be 90 degrees to your work surface. If it's not, you're going to get a strip that's thinner at the top than it is at the bottom. Same with a blade that isn't parallel with your miter slots, or with your miter slots are important, but if the blade is not parallel with the fence, then you'll get the same effect at the front and back end of the board, where one side will be wider than the other. This matters for the glue ups, especially if the blade is not exactly at 90 degrees, because that means when you go to glue things up, it's going to leave a gap on one edge or the other, and you're not going to get a very good glue joint. All right, I'm going to leave you with this final thought. If you have a wife, a girlfriend, a friends with benefits, any other significant other, and they are not happy with the size of wood they're getting, that is not a problem. You're a woodworker and you can take care of that. Take her out to the workshop and let her know that you got a new thin rip jig. And if she's the kind of woman that needs a nice thick hardwood, you can give that to her. But if she's the kind of woman that prefers a small softwood, you've got that covered too, and anything in between. So with that said, that wraps it up for today. If you like the video, give it a thumbs up, subscribe if you like, and remember, always be inspired and have fun. We'll catch you later. Hey guys, welcome back. Today I'm going to show you how I make thin strips like this here at the table saw safely with a jig called a thin cut rip jig. Thin cut rip jig. How far out we want our how far out, I don't know what I'm saying. Markings and stuff are useless for this scenario. That's probably useless information. What am I doing? Oh. And because there is a gap in the throat plate, now that's different than a deep throat plate, but this isn't like the throat in your neck, right? This isn't deep throating. This, so you could say that is a deep throat. But what we're going to do is we're going to take some tape and close up that gap. That's so stupid.